I come in from a slightly different angle, and I should perhaps first give you a little bit about my background. In 1979, I decided to resign from the Tropical Institute in Amsterdam to be an independent consultant. And within a few weeks, I ended up as interim director of research at WARDA. And a few months later, Norman crossed my path. We didn't meet for many years, actually, but he sent us the WARDA, the reports on SRI.
97, not 79, right?
98, in the spring of 98.
So 79, that's too.
No, 97 and 79. They countered to the WARDA scientists who didn't see any promise in it. I thought the agronomy made good sense. Though there were a lot of questions and a lot of issues that we didn't understand, I thought it made good sense. And so I continued working with Norman, and we tried to draw, Norman especially, of course, tried to draw attention in the world to this type of system. And we published a paper together, and I was amazed at the kind of vicious reaction that created. We were made out for voodoo scientists seeing UFOs. And next thing was that there were a number of papers coming out trying to prove the inferiority of SRI. And these papers were of a very simplistic nature, and we responded to it. And the whole argument was more and more vicious. So in 2003, I really say, for heaven's sakes, what is going on here? What is behind it? And so I, since I was in retirement, basically, I said, okay, I'll focus exclusively, almost exclusively, on SRI, because it's so fantastically fascinating and interesting. Here you have these questions of technique, of biology, political questions, commercial questions, psychological questions. And this whole makes a very fascinating ensemble to look at. So I'm doing this without pay and without any formal linkage to any institution. But I'm fascinated by it. Now, now come to my comments. First of all, like Tom, I think the authors of the report did an enormous job. It's a pretty ingrateful job, I would say, because you had a relatively limited time to go over masses of gray literature. And it becomes on a subject that has really had a polarized debate. So in the end, it is very, very difficult to come up with a report that everybody will accept and everybody will be pleased with. It's just simply not possible. Yeah? So I admire the enormous amount of literature that you turned up, but I think in today's society, unlimited access to literature through the internet, but that has no quality filter. And if I have some criticism, I say, gee, if you had been more critical in using papers, because the gray literature, there's a lot of doubtful material. Even in the peer-reviewed literature, there is things where we, in two cases, we reacted formally, but which really are surprising that they get published. So if you had been more critical, I think you could have pulled out certain highlights and focus on those, end up with a report that is much shorter and therefore much more to the punch. So right now, I think you have you got a bit mixed up in the too many details. I'm making a few general comments, and then I go to two specific ones. One of the problems I see with SRI, that SRI has become a label. Yeah? And like modern farming is a label, like organic agriculture is a label, but behind that, there is an array of processes and mechanisms that are much more concrete. So whenever somebody talks about SRI, you really don't know what he knows about and what it is. You have been looking at papers that were labeled SRI. Yeah? As I had to think of a debate Niels had a few years ago on organic farming with modern farming with Driebergen. And I think basically these debates that go between systems that are labels, they're basically ascientific. We don't know what we are talking about. And okay, the next comment was what I see as a dilemma. I mentioned already the huge supply of information, very often of questionable quality and relevance, for a range of farming systems that are then labeled as SRI. That's the one, and it is dilemma with what you have, of course. I mean, agriculture is hugely diverse, depending on agroecological, socio-economic, institutional factors, this whole array. And I try to illustrate that all these are sources of variability, and I put it in a small formula that agriculture output, let's say per hectare, it depends on location, weather, time, space, and then you add the factors of people. So no wonder any type of system, any type of technology will be subject to enormous variations when you make recordings in the field. There's no way around it. So I think we should be, in the subsequent phases of the project, we should be very critical that we do not start to what I would call measuring random variability. Yeah? That the factors, the variables that you're looking at, give variances that are smaller than the random variability of the environment in which you're working. Then you end up collecting enormous masses of data, and in the end it's very difficult to come to a conclusion. Now I come to the two major issues where I have reservations, and speaking as a kind of field agronomist, you will not be surprised that I say agronomy is the first one. The stakeholders is a stakeholder analysis is the second point. But there are many problems with these two issues. First thing I need to say about my own discipline. I see agronomy very much as an orphan discipline within the agricultural sciences. You go to Wageningen, you go to Reading, you go to any other university, I don't know, Cornell. If you want to study agronomy, no, you still soil chemistry, or you still fertility, or, you know. And it was nicely illustrated at the very beginning of my career. I arrived as a postdoc in the maize program at CIMMYT, and right away it was made clear, Willem, you have to understand, agronomy is always location specific. We as International Center cannot handle it. So it is secondary importance. And then they added, you better get into breeding because if you want to have a career here. I just finished the soil chemistry thesis, so I wasn't going into breeding again. But this has major ramifications, this attitude, because the agronomy as an orphan discipline is extremely weak. And I thought here in your report, for instance, you followed a kind of conventional view about agronomy, which was looking mostly at single factors. Yeah, you looked at spacing, you looked at the age of the seedling, and then you put it together in a package. But the whole thing is about interactions. And the one important one that I missed actually was the factor variety. You have no word about it. But variety is the start. The genotype is the start. And the genotype you see in terms of the genotype by environment interaction. And all these local varieties that are around, they have all been selected with that as a background. Adaptation to local environment. And you ask me, is that important? It is terribly important. I just had a message from Norman about the failure of the hybrid seed produced in China and sent to Bangladesh. Now this is, this is an extreme, of course. But when one bypasses this, this aspect, sorry. The other aspect where I think interaction is, and where still a lot of things we don't know, is when you compare two different systems, like SRI with the conventional, you basically change the water regime in the soil. If you change the water regime in the soil, you change everything. Yeah? So how are you going to compare two systems when everything changes? You change variety, you change the biotic or microbiotic environment in the soil because you go from an anaerobic to an aerobic system. The whole wheat problem, everything is, the density, everything is changed. So that leads me to the conclusion, again, the weakness of agronomic research, that the simple test that compares conventional with SRI is just simply not possible. There is no answer. There is no easy, quick answer. And instead, I think if you want to clarify the processes under SRI, you're dealing with a complex jigsaw puzzle. And you have a series of, you need a series of approaches, both biotechnical, but also socioeconomic. And gradually you piece together that system and you start to appreciate how it works. And that is the one great thing that has tremendously surprised me, that the international research community was not really interested in how the system works. No, it wanted to simply show that it was inferior. Yeah? So here are the implications of inadequate agronomy. I mentioned the questionable quality of field experiments and tests, because data are always affected by what I call the non-experimental factors. They are biophysical and human, people, that are simply beyond control of scientists. You don't know what happens. And therefore, the inadequate appreciation for the limitations of field data. And this all leads simple field tests being subject to very biased interpretations. And I think that's where we have been struggling. You have these data, huge masses of data, and we have been poking in it. People that were critical of SRI poked at these data and got up with publications. We have done the same, and we got also. So, okay. I go to the next one, the stakeholder issue. It's a very delicate issue, actually. And I think the report could have tried to be a little bit more specific, because it played such an enormous important role in the whole controversy. But I realize full well that, okay, you're at the beginning of your careers. I mean, it's difficult to say certain things that are not that, that your management of the Wageningen University might not be pleased with, or the donor will not be pleased with. But, okay, in my position, I can probably say it because I have no stakes. We should be aware that in the present age of extensive actor networks, yeah, and the high expectations of public-private collaborations, Wageningen, I think there should be a more general awareness that all these parties have different interests, and they're driven by different motives. Individuals as well as institutions. Okay, there's a very interesting, I have read with great interest the paper by, first papers by Dominic about the Monsanto and about the BT cotton, and I think they're extremely interesting parallels. The great difference is, of course, that nothing in SRI, I guess, is patentable. So there are no funds, yeah? Okay, that drives the research, no? So there are in the whole GMO debate, there are all kinds of collaborations between private sector and universities, but because there's money involved. So I would have liked to see some form of stakeholder analysis that would have presented clearly the major actors that were directly or indirectly involved in this debate, and what stakes they had, and how these stakes may have influenced their motives and have influenced their actions. And there is little doubt that there are various vested interests in the commercial private sector and the coalition with research, and I could very well imagine that the private sector, the large companies, are not at all interested in an SRI type of model, yeah, because of the recommendations we have. We advise 1/5 to 1/10 of the quantity of seed. I mean, I cannot imagine that the seed industry will be motivated to support that type of research. Same with agricultural chemicals. So, if I come to my conclusions now, yes. The conclusions are rather embarrassing, I would say. To me, SRI is, in a sense, down-to-earth agronomy. And I've elaborated on that in a paper that is actually in press now. And as the Indian and also the Malian situation show, farmers have little problem in understanding the principles of SRI and in applying them. And for them, increased yields, greatly increased yields, reduced costs of seed and chemicals, they don't need a complex economic analysis. I mean, they just do it. And this raises a very awkward question about agronomic research capabilities of these various centers of excellence that have actively opposed SRI in the past. That's the first conclusion. Now, if I add to that a stakeholder perspective, then I ask, were the top-notch international scientists that opposed SRI completely ignorant about this agronomy? I mean, you could hardly suppose that. And then that leaves only one question. In spite, and that is something which really hit me personally, in spite of all the rhetorics of the CG network about poverty alleviation, food security, sustainability, yeah, these same institutes tried deliberately to derail a package, a technology, an insight that was explicitly aimed at these poor farmers. What motives were behind it? Who pulled the strings? I don't know. But it is, of course, a painful question. Now, ironically, to end on a positive note, the whole debate and the so-called rice wars, of course, have given us a lot of attention. And I think that has been kind of a boomerang effect on the established research. And I am particularly excited that that we going beyond rice now. I mean, the principles, with modification, with adaptations, of course, there seems to be a whole range of other crops that react in very similar ways. And I'm very excited that the Indian group of PhD students will look at these things. How is SRI, or the core model, adapted by farmers when they go and use it in different environments? But also, what elements of the SRI package are being taken up in other crops? And it leads me, as an agronomist, to say, oh, maybe hope for agronomy, but we'll have to operate from a different perspective. Okay, that was the last one. Thank you.